Imagine coming home after months of service, only to find your marriage gone, your savings emptied, and your name forged on debts you never signed. This is the story of Michael, a soldier betrayed in silence, who turned that silence into a weapon. It was a quiet evening overseas when Michael opened his laptop, expecting a simple message from home. The desert sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving only the faint glow of the barracks light on his weary face. Weeks of duty had hardened his schedule, but not his heart. Home was the place that kept him going. The laughter in the kitchen, the smell of his wife Emily's cooking, the plans they had whispered into the future. But that night, everything shifted with a single email. The subject line was short, almost clinical. It read, "Let's handle this like adults." A dozen interpretations raced through his mind, but none prepared him for the storm inside. The message was brief, direct, and cold. Emily had decided she was done. She had filed for divorce, emptied their joint account, and moved on without a word spoken aloud. No calls, no letters, only an email. Michael stared at the screen, his heartbeat steady, but his thoughts spinning. Betrayal doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it arrives in silence, wrapped in the convenience of technology. He closed his eyes and took a breath, feeling the weight of years they had built together crack silently. Yet, there was no time for collapse. Not here. Not while sandstorms brewed outside and orders still waited to be followed. He didn't respond. Not immediately. He didn't shout or write a bitter line. Instead, he sat there, letting the pain settle like dust in an empty room. The anger would come later. The confusion would take its turn. For now, it was the quiet before the storm, and Michael knew storms were only dangerous when they struck without warning. Over the next few days, he replayed everything in his mind. The small signs he might have missed, the times she grew distant, the calls that seemed shorter, the sudden mentions of being too busy. Trust often blinds people, and he had worn it like armor. Now it lay cracked at his feet. But something inside him refused to break completely. There was more to this story. There had to be. No one dismantles a life overnight without a reason, and no one takes what isn't theirs without leaving a trace. He checked their accounts using the slow, patchy internet connection. The savings they had built for a new house, the funds for their future plans, gone. Transferred in pieces, small enough to avoid alerts, yet large enough to drain everything. It wasn't an accident, it was planned. That was the first confirmation that turned his pain into something colder. Focus. Michael started documenting quietly. Screenshots of bank statements, email logs, transaction histories, anything that told the story she had tried to bury under the cover of distance. He wasn't thinking of revenge yet. He was thinking of survival. When the foundation of a life crumbles, you don't rebuild on the ruins without knowing why they cracked. Night after night, while the others slept, he sat, under the dim light, collecting fragments of a betrayal that reached across oceans. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a moment of weakness on her part. It was deliberate, calculated. There were loans he hadn't signed, small debts opened under their joint name, and a sudden sale inquiry on their car, the one he had worked overtime to pay off. The emails from her stopped after that first one, as if she had already moved to another life where his existence was an inconvenience. And maybe that was the cruelest part. Not the theft, not the abandonment, but the indifference. Love does not vanish overnight. It is replaced, erased, or traded. The silence told him which one it was. Each morning, Michael put on his uniform and carried out his duties as if nothing had changed. His comrades noticed little. A soldier learns to wear his pain beneath the same armor he wears into battle. But inside, a seed had been planted, not of hatred, but of resolve. He wasn't going to lash out. He wasn't going to plead. He was going to wait, watch, and act when the ground was ready. Weeks passed, and deployment days shortened. Homecoming, once a beacon of comfort, now felt like walking into an unfamiliar storm. But he was no longer the same man who left. He was, returning with questions, evidence, and a silence that held more weight than any confrontation. As the transport plane lifted from the foreign runway, Michael stared at the horizon one last time. The life he left behind was not the life he was going back to, but something told him this story wasn't over. It was only unfolding, and far away, in a house that no longer felt like home, decisions were being made that would soon collide with the calm patience of a man who had learned to fight battles both on and off the field. The storm had not yet broken, but it was coming. The plane touched down on a cold morning, its wheels skimming the wet tarmac like a reluctant return to reality. Michael stepped out with the same measured stride he had used on countless missions, but this time the battlefield was different. The air smelled familiar, yet hollow. Home was not the sanctuary he had once imagined during long nights abroad. It was now a stage where truths waited in the shadows, ready to reveal themselves. The house greeted him with silence. Furniture was still in place, but the warmth was gone. Photographs had been removed from walls, small frames replaced by emptiness. In the bedroom, her scent lingered faintly, but it carried no comfort. Only the ghost of something lost. The joint account was indeed empty, as his quiet investigation had shown, but the scale of her departure became clearer with every room he entered. Closets had been stripped of her presence, drawers left ajar, as if in a rush, told their own quiet story. He did not storm through the house. He observed as one might observe a crime scene, careful, deliberate, detached. Betrayal, he had learned, rarely comes with chaos on the surface. It leaves subtle fractures in its wake. Half-torn bills, hastily moved furniture, forgotten receipts. On the kitchen counter lay a letter from the bank, not addressed to him, but to them both, confirming a pending refinance request for their house. The signature line bore a name that was supposed to be his. That was the moment the story deepened. It was no longer about a woman who left. It was about a scheme in motion, one that used his absence as a shield. The refinance was not just an act of desperation. It was a plan to extract what little remained, using his name as collateral. He had been reduced from a partner to a tool. Michael began piecing together timelines. Transactions began 3 months before her email. The withdrawals were spaced, carefully kept under reporting limits. The car had been sold weeks before he returned. The title transferred quietly to a buyer he had never heard of. Each document spoke of preparation, not impulse. Neighbors offered their own silent testimony. The once closed curtains of his living room had been open for unfamiliar cars at late hours. The garden he used to tend now lay trampled by footsteps too careless to belong. Names surfaced in whispers. A co-worker she had grown close to, a man who had appeared during his second month abroad. His name was on a recent property inquiry tied to their address. Still, Michael said nothing. He reached out to his bank, his attorney, and slowly began to build a record, a timeline of deceit dressed as independence. Every screenshot, every receipt, every email was a thread in a web he refused to let collapse on top of him. This was not about reclaiming love. That chapter had already closed. This was about reclaiming his life before it was rewritten without his consent. At night, he reviewed the mortgage statements. A new loan had been drafted, its co-applicant marked with a name he had never authorized. The signature, a poor imitation, of his sat beside hers. It was enough to freeze his blood, but not enough to freeze his judgment. Anger, when used recklessly, destroys evidence. Patience, when used strategically, collects it. Weeks passed as he maneuvered quietly. His calls to the bank were measured, his questions pointed but calm. He traced the trail of money to a separate account, not solely hers, but shared with the man now living in the house he had worked years to buy. It was an account that had grown fat from his sacrifices. The web expanded. There were credit cards opened under their joint name, debts he had never known, and plans to sell the house while his deployment orders still listed him overseas. It was a puzzle, and each piece fit too perfectly to be a coincidence. This was more than betrayal of love. It was betrayal of trust, law, and loyalty. The more he uncovered, the more he realized this was not just his story. There were others. A soldier he knew from training had experienced something similar. A letter buried in a community forum spoke of the same names, the same tactics, the same slow bleeding of a man too far to defend his own home. Patterns like this rarely act alone. They replicate. Michael documented them all. He spoke to the right people quietly, not for pity, but for leverage. He did not warn her. He did not confront her. Betrayal thrives on reaction, but justice feeds on preparation. Each day he lived as if normal. Each night he built the case of a man wronged, but not broken. Spring arrived, and with it, a notice from the county. The refinance had been approved, the funds released. But the account was already flagged from his earlier steps. The transaction was frozen, the balance untouchable. The man she had trusted to help her gain from his absence had unknowingly walked into a trap built by the very silence they assumed was defeat. And so, the web began to tighten. What had started with an email in the quiet of a desert evening was now a slow turning of the tide. There were still loose ends, and the fight was far from over, but Michael no longer stood on sinking ground. The betrayal was real, but now, so was his resolve. The days ahead would not be about mourning what was lost. They would be about reclaiming what was taken and exposing the hands that thought distance meant freedom from consequence. And somewhere across town, two people slept soundly, unaware that the silence they mistook for surrender was the sound of a storm gathering speed. The first signs of panic were subtle, almost imperceptible. A delayed email from the bank, a sudden call from her asking about a document he was never supposed to see. Michael didn't reply. Silence was still his greatest weapon. While she lived as if her decisions were buried under layers of distance, the ground beneath her was quietly shifting. His attorney moved with precision, freezing the questionable accounts before the funds could escape. A private investigator unearthed more. The co-worker she was involved with had a trail of similar relationships, each one coinciding with a sudden transfer of assets, each one ending with a quiet disappearance once the profit was drawn. It was no longer about a failed marriage. It was about a pattern, and patterns leave tracks. Michael began to see how deliberate the web had been. The co-worker, Jason, had guided her through every step, from the refinancing to the loans, from the quick property listings to the joint withdrawals. She had played her role, willingly or blindly, but the scheme was older than her betrayal. It had been rehearsed. The turning point came when a letter arrived. This time not from the bank, but from a law office. They claimed an overdue payment under his name, tied to a loan he had never applied for. But within their packet lay the evidence he needed: forged signatures, falsified communication, and a chain of authorizations that traced back to Jason's own email. Michael didn't need to confront them. He needed to let their own actions collapse on them. Working with the authorities, he provided the timeline, the proof, the connections. What had been whispers in a deserted barracks now became a file thick enough to demand attention. The house, once a home, became the center of a quiet storm. Foreclosure was halted. The refinance was reversed. The car, though sold, was traced back through false paperwork. Each thread pulled made the fabric thinner. And with every unraveling knot, their confidence began to show cracks. Still, Michael kept his distance. He didn't need a scene. He needed a resolution that would outlast anger. Friends advised confrontation. Family urged forgiveness. But he chose a different path, one paved with patience and law. Betrayal thrives in the shadows. He had simply learned to turn on the lights. As summer drew closer, the case reached its peak. The investigator delivered final reports. Multiple couples, same method, same accomplice. Authorities moved quickly. Assets were frozen across accounts Jason controlled. Emily, once so sure of her choices, received her first official notice. a demand for explanation that carried the weight of evidence she could no longer ignore. For the first time since that email, Michael felt the air clear. Not because the hurt had faded. Wounds like that don't heal on command. But because the imbalance was correcting itself. The man who had left in uniform with trust in his heart had returned to find betrayal, but he would not leave the battlefield of his own life without reclaiming what was his. The turning point wasn't a moment of revenge. It was the moment he realized he didn't have to raise his voice to be heard. The truth was speaking for him now. As proceedings began to unfold, Emily and Jason scrambled. Calls went unanswered. Lawyers shuffled papers late into the night. And in the silence of his own new apartment, Michael watched the pieces fall into place. The storm was no longer gathering. It was beginning to strike. Autumn arrived with a chill that felt cleaner than the year before. Michael stood outside the courthouse, the weight of months lifting in quiet increments. Inside, the final hearing had ended, not with a dramatic confession, but with the steady reading of agreements. The refinance voided, the debts reassigned, the stolen funds ordered to be repaid. The house, once the stage of betrayal, would be sold, not to erase memories, but to close a chapter that no longer served him. Emily had signed the papers with trembling hands. Jason had already vanished from her life, leaving behind the mess they had built together. The authorities pursued, him separately, their case strengthened by the evidence Michael had collected without a single raised word. There was no applause, no victory speech. Just a quiet understanding that some battles are won not by striking hardest, but by standing long enough for the truth to surface. Michael moved into a small place by the edge of town. Not the dream home he had planned, but a beginning untainted by the past. The money that was recovered wasn't everything, but it was enough to start over. More than the money, it was the principle that silence, patience, and strategy could build justice where anger would have built ruin. He spent his days rebuilding routines that had nothing to do with revenge. Early runs by the river, coffee at dawn, work that gave him purpose beyond the wounds left behind. The betrayal remained a scar, but not a cage. Months later, an envelope arrived. No return address, just a simple note inside. It was from another man, a soldier he had never met, thanking him for sharing the evidence that had exposed a larger scheme. Michael realized, in that moment, that his fight had not just been about him. It had cut a line through a pattern of exploitation that had lived too long in the silence of distance. The reckoning had not been loud. It had been deliberate, and it had set more than one person free. As the year closed, Michael stood on his porch, watching the leaves turn. There was no bitterness left in his stare, only the steady gaze of a man who had walked through fire and chosen not to burn others on his way out. Life would go on, different, quieter, maybe even better. Betrayal had written the first half of his story. He had written the second, and somewhere, far from the quiet street he now called home, the ones who thought distance was a shield were learning that some storms travel farther than they ever expect.